He saw a Cherokee widow taming a horse alone, so he took her home. The dust was the first thing you'd notice, the way it settled on everything like a second skin, a fine red powder that got in your mouth and in your eyes and coated the back of your throat. It was the taste of this land, a taste of grit and thirst. She tasted it every day. It was in the creases of her worn leather tunic, ground into the scuffed toes of her moccasins, and it clung to the black braid that hung heavy down her back. The sun was a hammer, relentless and white-hot, beating down on the sorry patch of earth that passed for a corral on the edge of a town that didn't want her. The silence was the second thing, a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the snort of the horse and the creak of the rope in her raw hands. The horse was a big bay, all muscle and wild eyes, sweat making his coat gleam like wet copper. He wasn't mean, not really, just terrified. He'd been running free and didn't understand ropes or fences or the small, determined woman who refused to let him go. He'd rear up, hooves slicing the air, and she'd just lean back, her small frame braced against the brute force of him, the rope burning lines into her palms. She didn't make a sound, no grunts of effort, no cries of pain. Her face was a mask of concentration, jaw set, dark eyes fixed on the animal. The pain was just a fact, like the sun and the dust. It was there. It had to be endured. There were men watching. There were always men watching, leaning against the wall of the general store, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. They weren't offering to help. They were watching a show. They'd murmur to each other, a low rumble of amusement and contempt. "Look at her," one of them, a fat man with a greasy vest named Jebediah, would say. "Thinks she can tame that beast. A squaw ain't got the strength." They didn't see a widow trying to secure the last living thing from her old life. They didn't see a woman fighting for a foothold in a world that had taken everything from her. They saw an inconvenience, a curiosity, an object. Her husband was gone, his blood soaked into a different patch of earth miles away. Her home was a pile of ash and charred timber, and all she had left was this horse, a ghost of her past, and the burning rope in her hands. The horse lunged, pulling her off her feet. She went down hard, the dust billowing up around her. She didn't let go of the rope. She just scrambled back up, her breath coming in ragged gasps, a smear of dirt and blood on her cheek. The silence from her was absolute. It was louder than any scream. It was the sound of a spirit that had been beaten but refused to break. The men chuckled. It was all a big joke to them. This lone woman, this native ghost haunting the edge of their civilized world, wrestling with a beast she couldn't possibly control. They saw weakness. They saw a thing to be used or discarded. The sun beat down, the dust settled, and the rope cut deeper into her skin. She just held on, her world shrunk to this single point of struggle, this battle of wills between her and the horse, under the empty, watchful sky. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, and the silence was the sound of her survival. Hey everyone, just wanted to jump in here for a second. If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a favor and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see where you all are tuning in from. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how this all unfolds. Your support means the world. All right, let's get back to the story. His name was Silas, and he didn't meddle. It was a rule he lived by. A code carved into him by things he'd seen and things he'd done, things he didn't ever want to talk about. He'd come into town for salt and shells, his wagon wheels kicking up the same red dust that seemed to coat the whole damn world. He kept his head down, his hat pulled low. He wasn't looking for conversation, and he sure as hell wasn't looking for trouble. But he saw it. You couldn't not see it. The woman in the makeshift corral, a small, stubborn figure against the massive shape of the horse. And he saw the men. He knew their type. Vultures in dusty boots, getting their entertainment from someone else's struggle. He stopped his wagon in the shade of the livery, telling himself he was just resting the mules. But he watched. He saw her go down in the dirt and get back up, the rope still clutched in her hands. He saw the way she didn't make a sound, her defiance a silent wall against the heat and the pain and the mocking laughter from the store porch. Something in him stirred. An old, rusty part of him he thought had seized up for good. It wasn't pity. He had no use for pity. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. He recognized the look of a creature backed into a corner, with nothing left to do but fight. He should have just climbed back on his wagon and gone. It wasn't his business. The world was full of cruelty and injustice, and a man could break himself trying to fix even a small piece of it. He knew that better than most, but he kept watching. The horse reared again, a storm of frantic energy, hooves like hammers just inches from her head. She didn't flinch, she just held her ground. And that was it. That was the moment. He didn't think about it. He just moved. He swung down from the wagon, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He walked toward the corral, his strides long and even. The laughter from the men faltered, turning into curious murmurs. They knew Silas, the quiet man who lived out on the creek, who kept to himself. They didn't know what to make of this. He didn't look at them. He didn't look at anything but the woman and the horse. He unlatched the cheap gate and stepped inside the circle of dust and fear. He stopped a few feet from her. "That horse is gonna kill you," he said. His voice was rough like stones grinding together. She turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto him. There was no fear in them, just weariness and a deep, bottomless distrust. She said nothing. She just tightened her grip on the rope. He sighed, a short, sharp sound of exasperation. He wasn't here to argue. He walked forward and held out his hand, not for her to take, but for the rope. She hesitated, her knuckles white. He just waited, his hand steady. Finally, slowly, she let the rope slacken, and he took it from her. He didn't yank it. He just took the tension, letting the horse feel a different kind of hand, a different kind of will. He started talking to the animal, a low, meaningless rumble of sound. He walked in a slow circle, never taking his eyes off the horse, letting the rope slide through his calloused palms. He wasn't breaking it. He was just convincing it that the world wasn't ending. The horse snorted, tossed its head, but its frantic energy began to ebb, replaced by a wary curiosity. The beast was listening, and in that shared moment of taming, a connection was made, not with words, but with the simple, solid presence of a man who had decided, for reasons he didn't even understand himself, to meddle. He got the horse settled, its sides still heaving but the wild terror gone from its eyes. He tied the rope to a sturdy fence post, the knot sure and practiced. Then he turned and looked at the woman. Really looked. He saw the exhaustion that was bone deep etched into the lines around her eyes. He saw the angry red welts on her hands, some of them split open and bleeding into the dust caked on her skin. He saw the hollows in her cheeks. She was starving. He made another decision just as quick and unthinking as the first one. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered in that same gravelly, no-nonsense tone. She flinched, taking a small step back. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She'd heard offers from men before. They were never kind. He saw the fear and didn't know how to fix it with words, so he didn't try. He just turned his back on her and walked toward his wagon, leading the now compliant horse. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just trusted that she was too worn out to have any other choice. He heard the soft scuff of her moccasins in the dust behind him. He loaded the horse onto the back of his wagon and climbed up to the seat. She stood there, a small, lost figure in the street. He just looked down at her and jerked his head toward the seat beside him. She hesitated for a long moment. Then, with a visible effort, she pulled herself up. The ride to his cabin was silent. The sun began to dip low, painting the sky in brutal streaks of orange and purple. His place was nothing much. A small, solid cabin made of logs he'd cut and squared himself. A stone chimney breathing a thin line of old smoke into the air. A corral, a shed, and a whole lot of nothing in every direction. It was a place for a man who wanted to be left alone. He helped her down from the wagon, then tended to the horses without a word. She just stood by the cabin door, looking as if she might bolt at any second. He ignored her, letting her get the feel of the place. Inside, it was spare and clean. A stone hearth, a table with 2 chairs, a cot in one corner, and shelves holding a few tins and sacks of flour. He got the fire going in the hearth, the crackle of the kindling, the first friendly sound she'd heard all day. He gestured to a bucket and a pump outside. "Water," was all he said. While she was gone, he sliced thick pieces of bacon into a skillet and opened a can of beans. The smell of frying meat filled the small cabin, a rich, life-affirming scent. When she came back in, her face and hands dripping with clean water, he had a bowl of hot water and a clean rag sitting on the table. He didn't say, "Clean your hands." He just put it there, an offering, a tool. She understood. She soaked her raw hands in the warm water, her face impassive. But he saw the tight line of her shoulders relax just a fraction. He dished up 2 plates of beans and bacon and a hunk of hard bread for each of them. He put her plate on the table and took his to a stool by the fire, turning his back to her, giving her the privacy to eat without being watched. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on tin plates and the hiss of the fire. When they were done, he took the plates and washed them. He laid a thick wool blanket and a small flattened pillow made of a grain sack on the floor by the hearth, the warmest spot in the house. "You sleep there," he said. And then he went to his own cot on the far side of the room, blew out the lamp, and lay down. He didn't say good night. He didn't offer any words of comfort. He just offered shelter, a full belly, a safe place to rest. For a woman who had nothing, it was everything. The days fell into a rhythm, a quiet routine marked by the sun's travel across the sky. There were chores, wood to be chopped, water to be hauled, snares to be checked. They moved around each other in the small space of the cabin and the larger space of the homestead, a silent partnership forming out of shared tasks. He never asked her questions, and she never offered any information. Her past was a locked room, and he didn't have the key, didn't even try the handle. One afternoon he was out by the small fenced enclosure behind the woodshed. It was the one place he went that wasn't for a chore. Inside the fence were 2 mounds of earth, each marked with a simple cross made of lashed-together branches. He stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, just looking at the dirt. She watched him from the cabin doorway. She saw the way his shoulders slumped, the way his head bowed. She knew what that place was. Every soul carried a graveyard inside them. His was just visible. That night, the silence by the fire felt different, heavier. He was cleaning his rifle, the methodical scrape and click of the metal parts filling the room. He stopped, holding a piece of oiled cloth in his hand, and stared into the flames. "Fever took him," he said, his voice a low rasp. She didn't have to ask who him was. 2 winters back, the boy went first, his mother. She held on for a week. He didn't look at her. He just spoke the words into the fire, plain and hard and stripped of any feeling. They were just facts, terrible facts. He set the rifle part down and picked up another. The story was over. The silence that followed was an invitation. She took a breath. Her own voice was hoarse when she spoke, rough from days of disuse. "My husband was called Tokay," she began, the name a strange weight in the air. "He was a good hunter. He could track a deer for 2 days. She spoke in a rambling, halting way, as if pulling the memories from a deep, painful well. White men came. They had papers. Said the land wasn't ours anymore. Our people had been on that land since the first sunrise. She paused, her eyes distant. It was good land, near the river. They wanted it. The papers were just an excuse. Tokay, he would not leave. He said a man does not leave his home. He fought, he was brave. Her voice didn't tremble. It was flat, a simple recounting of the worst day of her life. They had many guns. They shot him. Then they burned our lodge. They burned everything. She stopped. That was all. She had handed him the jagged pieces of her past. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't offer any useless words. He just nodded, slowly. He stopped his work on the rifle and looked at her. Really looked at her, across the flickering firelight. "I was a soldier," he said, the admission costing him something. "Fought in the war, down south, saw things a man shouldn't see." He looked down at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "I don't like to talk about it." And that was it. A blunt confession for a blunt confession. They didn't share comfort, they shared wounds. In the quiet cabin surrounded by the vast, dark wilderness, 2 ghosts sat by a fire and recognized the scars on each other's souls. The peace they'd built was as fragile as a skim of ice on water. The outside world was bound to come crashing in sooner or later. It came in the form of 3 men on horseback, kicking up a cloud of self-important dust as they rode right up to the edge of Silas's property. It was Jebediah, the fat man from town, and 2 of his usual cronies. their faces flushed with cheap whiskey and mean intentions. They stopped at his fence line, their horses shifting nervously. They'd seen the bay horse, her horse, in his corral. They'd seen the smoke curling from his chimney. They knew she was here. "Silas!" Jebediah's voice was a greasy shout that tore through the quiet afternoon. "You in there, Silas? We know you got that Cherokee whore in there with you." The words were ugly, meant to provoke, meant to stain the air. The cabin door opened. Silas stepped out onto the small porch, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. It wasn't pointed at them, but it was there, a clear, unspoken statement. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, waiting. A moment later, she appeared in the doorway behind him. She didn't cower or hide. She stood tall, her face a mask of stone, her eyes fixed on the men, a silent, solid presence at his back. Their unity was a visible thing, a fortress wall they'd built without a single word. "Now, Silas," Jebediah said, trying for a reasonable tone that didn't fit him. "Some of the folks in town are concerned. It ain't right, you keeping her out here. She ought to be on a reservation with her own kind. You're in the ground with the rest of 'em." The threat was barely veiled. Silas's face didn't change. His eyes were flat and hard as river stones. "This is my land," he said, his voice low and carrying. "Get off it." Just that. A simple command. No argument, no explanation. Jebediah bristled. His authority was being challenged by a man he considered a reclusive crank. "We're just looking out for the community, Silas. We can't have you harboring strays. It ain't decent." "I said," Silas repeated, his voice dropping even lower, gaining a dangerous edge. "Get off my land." He shifted his weight, and the rifle moved with him, a subtle but unmistakable motion. The two cronies looked at Jebediah, their drunken courage starting to leak away. They were bullies, not fighters, not when the odds weren't overwhelmingly in their favor. Silas's quiet intensity was more frightening than any amount of shouting. Jebediah held his gaze for a long moment, his face turning a blotchy red. He was beaten and he knew it. He spat on the ground. "This ain't over, you hear me? The good people of this town won't stand for it." He yanked on his horse's reins, turning it so sharply the animal protested. "Let's go, boys." They rode off, throwing backward glances full of impotent rage. Silas and the woman stood on the porch, watching, until they were just small specks in the distance. The immediate danger had passed. But they both knew it was just a skirmish, not the end of the war. He had stood between her and the world, and she had stood with him. The standoff with Jebediah changed things. A line had been drawn in the dust, and they were on the same side of it. The silence between them was different now. Not a void, but a space filled with an unspoken understanding. It was a partnership forged in survival, a bond hammered out on the anvil of shared threat. They worked. That's what they did. The days were filled with the rhythm of labor, and now they moved with an easy, practiced synchronicity. When he was mending a fence post that had rotted through, she was there with the next rail before he even had to ask for it. When a storm blew in and threatened to tear a loose shutter from the cabin wall, they were out in the wind and the rain, him holding it steady while she hammered the nails in with a rock, her movements quick and sure. One day he brought out the rifle and a few precious shells. He set up a tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. "You need to know how," he said simply. He stood behind her, his body a solid presence, and guided her hands to the proper grip. His calloused fingers brushed against hers as he adjusted her stance. "Breathe out slow," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "Squeeze. Don't pull." The closeness wasn't romantic. It was practical, a transfer of knowledge, of power. The rifle's kick was a shock, a brutal shove against her shoulder, but the can flew off the post. A small smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a fleeting, fragile thing, but he saw it. Another day, the bay horse, the one she called Spirit in her own tongue, got spooked by a snake and bolted, crashing through a weak section of the corral fence. She went after him without a thought, tracking him into the rocky hills behind the cabin. She was gone for hours. When the sun started to dip, a knot of worry tightened in Silas's gut. He took his rifle and went after her. He found her not far from a dried-up creek bed. She'd found the horse, but she'd slipped on some loose shale and her ankle was twisted, swollen and angry-looking. She was trying to hobble back, using a branch as a crutch, her face pale with pain. He didn't say a word. He just walked up, scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and started the long walk back, leading the horse behind him. The journey back to the cabin was a silent one. He carried her inside and set her down gently by the fire. He cut away her moccasin and examined the swollen ankle with practiced hands. He set the bone with a quick, efficient movement that made her gasp, a sharp intake of breath. But she didn't cry out. He bound the ankle tightly with clean strips of cloth. She had rescued his peace of mind with the rifle. He had rescued her from the wilderness. The balance was always being kept. He was the unmoving stone of the mountain. She was the persistent water that flowed around it, finding its way. Together, they were becoming a landscape, a permanent feature in this wild, unforgiving place. They ran out of flour. It was a simple fact of life, and it meant they had to go to town. The thought of it sat like a stone in both their stomachs. The cabin, the land around it, had become their world, a safe harbor. Town was the hostile sea they now had to cross. As they rode in on the wagon, the bay horse tied to the back, they could feel the eyes on them. It started as soon as they reached the first smattering of houses. A curtain would twitch, a face would appear in a window and then vanish. By the time they reached the main street, it felt like the whole town had stopped to watch them pass. It was a gauntlet of silent judgment. The whispers started, loud enough to be heard. "There he is," a woman hissed to her friend from the boardwalk. "The one who took up with that savage." Another man, loafing outside the saloon, spat in the dirt as they passed. "Disgraceful," he muttered. "Ought to be ashamed." Silas's face was a mask of indifference. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, his hands steady on the reins. He gave no sign that he heard them, that he felt the weight of their hate. He was a mountain, letting the wind whip around him. She sat beside him, her back ramrod straight, her head held high. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower, but he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the tight grip of her hands in her lap. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. The silence that fell over the street was heavy and thick with malice. He helped her down, his hand briefly on her elbow, a small, steadying gesture. They walked into the store together. The place went quiet. The storekeeper, a balding man named Peters with shifty eyes, stopped what he was doing and stared at them. A woman with 2 small children quickly gathered them up and scurried out the door, pulling them away as if she and Silas were carriers of a plague. Silas ignored it all. He walked to the counter and started his list in his flat, even voice. "Need a sack of flour, salt, coffee, box of shells." Peters gathered the items with a sour look on his face, slamming them down on the counter. He tallied up the cost, his lips moving silently. "That'll be $3, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Then he looked past Silas, at her, and a nasty smirk crossed his face. "And 50 cents for company." Silas didn't rise to the bait. He didn't raise his voice. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out his money pouch. He carefully counted out $3 silver and laid them on the counter. Not a penny more. He didn't pick up the supplies. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Peters. The silence stretched. Peters began to sweat under the unblinking, granite-hard stare. It wasn't a threat of violence, it was a deeper, more profound challenge. It was the weight of a man's certainty against a weasel's spite. Finally, Peters couldn't take it anymore. He looked away, his eyes darting around the store as if looking for an escape. "Fine, fine," he muttered, pushing the coins into his till. Silas calmly gathered their supplies, turned his back on the humiliated storekeeper, and walked out. She was right behind him. The whole town watched them go, their whispers following them like a foul wind. The line was drawn in the dust of that hateful town, and it was only a matter of time before someone tried to cross it. The confrontation came as they were loading the last of their supplies into the wagon. The doors of the saloon swung open, and Jebediah and his 2 cronies stumbled out, their faces slick with sweat and beer. They were drunker this time, and meaner. They saw Silas and the woman, and their path shifted, their purpose clear. They swaggered over, blocking the way to the wagon. "Well, well," Jebediah slurred, a nasty grin on his face. "Look what we have here. I thought we told you to keep your pet at home, Silas." Silas didn't answer. He just finished placing a sack of flour in the wagon bed and turned to face them, positioning himself slightly in front of her. His body was a shield, "We're leaving, Jebediah," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. "Get out of the way." Jebediah laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "I don't think so. I think the town's decent folk have had enough of you and your squaw." He spat the word out like it was poison. That's when it happened. While Jebediah was trying to puff himself up, one of the other men, a lanky youth with cruel eyes, saw his chance. He lunged forward and grabbed her arm. "Come on, little bird," he sneered, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Why don't you come have a real drink with a real man?" It was the line, the one Silas had spent years building around himself, a wall of non-involvement, of minding his own damn business. And in that instant, he tore it down with his own two hands. There was no thought, only action. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. He wasn't the slow, deliberate homesteader anymore. He was the soldier he tried to forget. He hit the man holding her arm. It wasn't a wild swing. It was a short, brutal, piston-like punch that landed squarely on the man's jaw. There was a sickening crack of bone on bone. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even landed. The street went silent. Jebediah, shocked sober for a second, fumbled for the knife at his belt. He was too slow. Silas was already on him. He grabbed Jebediah's wrist, twisted it with a practiced, brutal efficiency that spoke of countless drills and real-life battles. Jebediah howled in pain as the knife clattered uselessly into the dust. Silas shoved him back, and Jebediah stumbled and fell over his unconscious friend, landing in a heap of tangled limbs and humiliation. Silas stood over them, his chest heaving, not from exertion but from a rage so cold it burned. He looked at Jebediah, his eyes promising a world of pain. "Don't," he said, the word a piece of ice. "Ever." Another pause. "Touch her." The final word was a death sentence. Again. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on the wreckage, his personal code now lying in pieces on the ground with them. He went to her, took her arm gently, the one the man had grabbed, and helped her onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a flick of his wrist, guided the mules away. He didn't look back. He had crossed a line, not just for her, but for himself. He had chosen a side. He had chosen her. The ride back was a long one, every mile stretching out under a sky that had turned the color of a fresh bruise. The air in the wagon was thick with unspoken things, with the echo of the violence and the sharp, clean scent of a boundary that had been irrevocably crossed. He drove the mules hard, wanting to put the stink of that town behind them, wanting the clean, quiet air of his own land. Back at the cabin, the familiar rituals felt different. He unhitched the mules, she unloaded the supplies. They moved around each other with the same quiet efficiency, but a new current ran beneath the surface. He had bled for her, in a way. He had spent a piece of his hard-won peace to defend her. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He was sitting on his stool, staring at his own hands, at the raw, split knuckles of his right hand. He'd done it without thinking, but now, in the quiet, the cost of it was settling in. "They won't stop," he said to the fire. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. "This will get worse before it gets better." She was sitting on the blanket by the hearth, watching him. She nodded once, a small, sharp movement. "I know." A long silence fell, filled only by the crackle of burning wood. Then she began to speak. Her voice was low, steady, a river that had finally broken through a dam. She told him everything, not just the stark facts of the fire and the killing, but the small, intimate details that give a life its texture. She told him about Tokay, her husband, how he would sing off-key when he thought no one was listening, how he carved her a small wooden bird that she kept tied in her braid. She spoke of her mother's garden, the smell of the corn and squash growing in the sun, the stories the old women would tell as they worked. She painted a picture of a life that was rich and full, a life that had been stolen in a single day of fire and smoke and screams. She spoke of running, of hiding in the woods for days, eating berries and roots, her grief a cold, hard stone in her belly. She talked about finding the bay horse, the only other living thing to escape the flames, and how his wild spirit mirrored her own. Her story poured out of her, raw and unpolished, a confession offered up to the one person who had not tried to take anything from her, but had instead stood in front of her as a shield. He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't offer any empty platitudes. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, and bore witness to her pain. He let her words wash over him, filling the empty spaces in the cabin, filling the empty spaces in him. When she was finally done, a profound quiet settled over the room. The story was told. The weight had been shared. She looked at him, her dark eyes clear in the firelight. "In the town," she said softly, "they call me names. The widow, the squaw. That is what they see. A thing without a name." She took a deep breath. "That is not my name." He waited, his gaze locked with hers. "My name," she said, the words clear and strong, "is Nita." The name hung in the air between them. It was a gift, the most profound act of trust she could offer. He had defended her body in the street. Now she was giving him her soul, her true self. He nodded slowly, the rugged lines of his face softening in the firelight. He let the name settle in his mind. "Nita," he said, his rough voice making it solid, real. It wasn't the name of a victim. It was the name of a survivor. The next morning broke clear and cold. The air felt washed clean, new. A change had taken place in the small cabin, a shift in the very foundations of their quiet life. The last of the ghosts had been faced. When Silas went outside, he didn't head for the woodpile or the corral. He walked purposefully to the small fenced-in plot of land behind the cabin, the place with the two rough-hewn crosses. Nita watched him from the doorway, her newly mended moccasins silent on the wooden step. She knew that ground was sacred to him, a place of memory and sorrow. She expected him to stop at the two graves, to have his moment of quiet communion as he sometimes did. But he didn't. He walked right past them, to a patch of bare, untilled earth just beside them. He had his spade in his hand, its metal edge glinting in the early morning sun. He pushed the spade into the tough, dry soil and turned over the first clod of earth. He was breaking new ground. Nita watched him for a long moment, then turned and went back inside the cabin. She returned a moment later, her hands cupped carefully around a small, soft leather pouch tied with a strip of rawhide. It was old, the leather darkened with age and handling. She walked out to him, her steps sure and steady. He stopped his work and looked at her, his face questioning. She didn't say a word. She just knelt down in the dirt beside the patch he was clearing. Carefully, she untied the pouch and poured its contents into her palm. Seeds. Small, hard kernels of multicolored corn. They were the last thing she had from her mother's garden. A tiny, impossibly resilient piece of the life that had been burned to the ground. They were the seeds of her past. He looked from the seeds in her hand to her face, and he understood. He nodded once, a slow, solemn gesture, and went back to his work with the spade, turning over the soil with a new purpose. When he had cleared a small square of earth, he knelt down opposite her. The two of them, the quiet man of the mountains and the woman of the river, knelt in the dirt together. His past was buried a few feet away. Her past was held in the palm of her hand. In the silence of the morning, under the vast open sky, they began to plant. He would make a hole in the soft earth with his finger, and she would drop a single seed into the darkness. It was a ritual, a promise, an unspoken agreement that this place, this piece of land that had held so much of his sorrow, would now also hold the promise of her future. They were planting a garden. They were planting a home. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more content just like this. Thanks for watching.